The alternative revised history of British New Zealand by the scholars of Hobson's Pledge. British New Zealand was first settled by Melanesian, South American, Egyptian, Phoenician, Celtic, and the Welsh. In 1350 AD, Eastern Polynesians arrived after a failed fishing expedition and were stranded in British New Zealand. The Polynesians, who would later become known as Maoris, started to violently exterminate the other magnificent civilizations of millions of people. How they ever managed to destroy all the archaeological evidence of these grand civilizations, we don't care. These Maoris live like primitive cavemen, and their existence is inconsequential to the glory of the British Empire. In 1769, the racially superior Captain James Cook arrived at Poverty Bay. He killed off 6 of the savages on the first day. This was not a massacre. The savages were being really aggressive, doing huckers, and not acting like British gentlemen. During the early 1800s, the savages started a civil war where they almost exterminated themselves. Us, cultured, civilized British people who hadn't had any civil wars or been at war with the French for 1,000 years, had to intervene. On 28th of October 1835, the noble savages sent a document to the British Colonial Office called the Declaration of Independence. Basically, we just need to ignore this document. It's irrelevant. In February 1840, Lieutenant William Hobson arrived to sign a treaty with the Maoris. The Maoris got down on their knees and practically begged Hobson to sign the treaty because they were terrified of self-extermination and these other mystical people called the French. The Treaty of Waitangi promised undisturbed estates, forest, and fisheries to anyone they decided to immigrate here. It did not protect the interests of the Maoris in any way, shape, or form. The treaty was not some kind of gravy train that led to the race-based privilege that us British people had to suffer from. The chiefs surrendered their sovereignty willingly so they could have the privilege of living in a cultured British society. We proceeded to form a government but didn't let any of the Maoris in as members of parliament because we didn't want to share power despite the fact they were the majority of the population. In 1863, the Maoris have refused to pledge loyalty to Her Majesty Queen Victoria, so we paid a large sum of money to get the British Army to make them pledge loyalty to Her Majesty the Queen. In 1879, the armed constabulary invaded the passive village of Parihaka. The invaders did not rape and pillage this village. They were complete gentlemen, and anything to the contrary is complete lies. No violent attacks on women and children because nothing was reported to the armed constabulary. As a consequence of us having to pay for the British Army to come to the other side of the world, we needed to confiscate the Maoris' land to pay for the invasion of the Waikato. It was really the Maoris' fault for not submitting to our authority because the Treaty of Waitangi said nothing about protecting their lands for them. It was them that breached the treaty. After we vanquished the Maoris and taken the land that was rightfully ours, we turned British New Zealand into the glorious Britain of the South Pacific. In 1914, the evil Huns started a war in Europe. The Maoris were given the privilege of fighting for Great Britain to defend the British Empire. Unfortunately, some of those uppity Maoris point blank refused to go and fight in World War I after we had been so benevolent to them. Then in World War II, a couple of Maoris helped out there, nothing significant. But in the 1970s, this is when the Maoris started to get belligerent. they started to talk about a document no one had ever heard of called the Treaty of Waitangi. They wanted handouts like this was some kind of gravy train. How could they betray our benevolence and kindness to them of all the technologies British colonists never invented, like the Toyotas and Nissan vehicles that were a result of our superior technology? In the later part of the 20th century, the Maoris continued to bludge off our hard-earned tax dollars, and the decades of the treaty settlement gravy train industry got as high as the defense budget of a single year. Then along came the wise and brave Dr. Brash, who had recently been the Reserve Bank governor and advised the government to sell off state-owned assets in a neoliberal enrichment of the wealthiest people in the country, causing mass unemployment. Dr. Brash championed the suffering of British New Zealanders who were victims of iwi corporates. Dr. Brash, now the leader of the opposition, made the greatest speech in the history of British New Zealand. This speech at Orewa, this was in no way, shape or form patronising. Dr. Brash went on to become the leader of Hobson's Pledge, an organisation that will adapt the mantle of victimhood for anything awarded to the Maoris.